Hi, I'm Wes Allen with DM Tales, and today I'm going to be talking about Open Legend, open source RPG. Let's roll it. Now, Open Legend was kickstarted back in 2016 and it shipped in 2018, which is a pretty nice turnaround for a project like this. Its byline is that it is an open source RPG, which is true, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the review. Overall, it is a genreless game, meaning you can play it with basically any setting that you want. All the descriptions in the game are about the mechanics. They're not telling you how the narrative effects of these things work, which is actually one of the coolest things about this game and has sparked my imagination. The book is hardbound, really good, heavy card stock for the cover, and it comes in at 140 pages. The body text is a very easy to read serif font that I very much appreciate, and the headings are a bold purple, which looks great on the page. I do have to point out that some of the glyphs are just a tad difficult to discern at a glance, but really, overall, the book is gorgeous. The pages also have a nice subtle texture to them, which is not distracting. That's a very nice thing to pull off. And one of the things I've noticed is that on the glossy pages, that texture really helps to lessen the glare a little bit, which is a very nice trick. I'm actually in love with the footers. It's done in a metallic ink, almost goldish, and there's a magic effect that surrounds the page numbers on the alternating pages, which is really cool. And a line across the bottom gives that bolt a sense of movement. So there really is an energy to the page, which I like. It's kind of cool. The one thing I do need to point out is that the information that you would normally find in the header of a page is actually found in the footer in this book, and that includes things like chapter title. One of my critiques of the book is that that font could use a little bit more weight to become more readable. But overall, it is a really nicely designed book, and I'm very glad to have it on my shelf. So for building a character, it might feel a little bit overwhelming at the start because there are 18 attributes in the game that are divided into 4 different groups. They are physical, mental, social, and extraordinary. You are getting your attribute scores by a point-buy system. At first level, you have 40 points to spend, but it is not a one-to-one ratio in buying different ability scores. The higher the ability score gets, the more points you need to spend in order to attain it. And it's a way of helping to strategize how you're designing your character at the beginning. But because they want to be merciful on people who may have no experience with this type of system, they did create 3 examples of score breakdowns in the book. These are for a specialist who has very high scores in certain areas, well-rounded, which is just good scores all around, and then a jack of all trades with scores that are okay pretty much across the board as far as you can spread them. Any attribute which has a score of 0 does not get one of the benefits of the game, which is something called attribute dice. The benefits for having high scores in a particular attribute are not static the way they are in a lot of other games. Instead, depending on your attribute score, you're going to get an extra die to roll. These attribute dice range from a 1d4 for a score of 1, all the way down to a score of 10 when you get to roll 4d8 for your attribute dice. This can lead to some rather large numbers that you roll for attribute checks. Attributes are not the only things which define your character's playability. There are other ways to power up and otherwise design your characters. The first of these is through the use of things called boons and banes. A boon is something that's going to help your character or your character's party, and a bane is something you want to afflict on an enemy. The cool thing about boons and banes is in Open Legend, you have access to any boon or bane that you have the required attribute score for. So you're not limited to just 3 or 4 that link to your character class. If you have an attribute that can access that boon or that bane, you're allowed to use it. Now, the fact that a player can access any boon or any bane for which they have the prerequisite ability score might seem a little bit overwhelming and actually overpowered because they can do anything in the game that they have access to. Because normally in things like D&D or other games that you're limited to certain abilities that match your character class, and that is just right out of the window in Open Legend. Instead, the way this is developed is that each character has their own fiction. And so the player who's running that character is going to develop their preferred boons and their preferred banes based on the fiction they are imagining for their character. And it's going to be incumbent upon a GM to create a world which creates kind of a guideline for the types of boons and banes that are going to be common in this world, and also for the party to develop together the way they're going to interact in their boons and their banes that they inflict in this world so that they each give themselves space to shine. It takes a little work to get used to, and it's going to take a little work to actually develop a way to make these work together. But once it gets flowing, I really think that it's going to be cool. And then as the characters grow, they can take on different boons or different banes that they want to use inside this world. In my test creation of a character, I developed a pyromancer who wanted the persistent damage bane. They just wanted to light people on fire and keep them that way. I think I was angry that day, I'm not sure. But what I was looking at is that to get that persistent damage, I would have a 4 in my energy score. That's how it's activating that pyromantic ability. But if I went up to an ability score of 5, all of a sudden I could have access to flight. And I thought, well, that would be really interesting. Perhaps as they become more comfortable, they learn to direct the energy that comes out of their hands or their feet and use it to generate thrust and take off. And I thought that would be really cool. And that's the types of things that you can do in Open Legend that you just can't do in another game because you're very much locked into what your character class can do. Kind of a neat feature. Now, going along with boons and banes are something called feats. And feats are something that you have to buy. You need points to purchase them, and you can purchase them at different power levels or different tiers for each of those feats. And each tier is going to give you access to different ways to apply them into the world. Each of the feats is going to apply some mechanical benefits in the game, making you particularly good at certain actions that you might want to undertake inside the narrative. But the way that these feats actually gets triggered inside the fiction itself, well, that's left up to the player characters and the GM and the world that they've created together. So as I said, Open Legend is genreless. If you're playing a fantasy game and someone wants to do persistent damage like my pyromancer, well, they have the magical ability to catch something on fire. But if you are playing a science fiction campaign and you have that persistent damage to create fire, maybe you have a heat ray that's just going to ignite people and keep them on fire as long as you have that heat ray on them. It's really cool that you can jump genres like that and the mechanics stay the same. Character advancement is rather straightforward. For every 3 experience points that you get as a PC, you go up 1 level. The immediate benefit of going up a level is that you're able to now have higher attribute scores. You start out with a max score of 5, and then you can go up to 6 all the way up to 10. But the cool thing about Open Legend is that every time you get an experience point, you get immediate benefits. You don't have to wait until you level up. Each experience point gives you 3 attribute points to spend and 1 extra feat point. You can bank these for later and accumulate them so you can buy a much larger attribute benefit or a bigger feat. And that's really cool. Grinding kind of gets taken out of the game at this point. You're not just running around killing things or trying to accumulate treasure just so you can get a little more hit dice or 1 more spell to cast during your day. Every time you get an experience point, your character can buff up just a little bit. And so your acceleration curve is a little bit faster, and I really like that. Now, ability rolls should be basically familiar to anyone who has ever played Dungeons & Dragons or any other role-playing game that uses a d20, because the base of your ability roll is a d20 against a target number. If you meet or exceed the target number, your character succeeds, and if you fall short of the target number, one of 2 things happens. 1, your character can fail, but the story progresses, so there's never a dead end. And 2, you can succeed, but there is a twist. Maybe you get put into danger. And there's a couple examples that are put inside the Open Legend core rulebooks, but the one that I really like goes all the way back for fans of Critical Role. The original campaign had this issue that they could never open locked doors. No matter how hard they try, they would just sit in front of locked doors because they couldn't break these things down or unlock them. And in Open Legend, that just goes out the window because they don't want to have that moment where, well, now you try that roll, or now you try that roll, now you try that. Oh, heck with it, I'm knocking the door down. Basically, if you succeed, you succeed. And if you fail, the story's going to progress. So maybe you can't unlock the door, but you hear the jingling of keys as the guard who has the key for that door is coming around the corner. And now you have an opportunity to get through the door in another way. Or maybe you unlock the door, and the example that's given in Open Legend's core rulebook is that you unleash a gas trap. And the person who was unlocking the door, they fall unconscious, and now everybody else has to decide what they're going to do in response to this now open door and knockout gas that's flooding the hallway. I like it. There's a nice mix in this game between more narrative-focused games like Powered by the Apocalypse games and more dice-centric games like Dungeons & Dragons or other OSR rules. And it's a good mix. I really appreciate it that the story's always going to be progressing, and the GM has a lot of fun being able to create misery for players who fail rolls. This is something that appeals to me. One of the cool things about your ability rolls inside Open Legend is that you do get to add your attribute dice to the roll. So let's go back to my Pyromancer who has a 4 in energy. If they're doing something that requires energy, like lighting someone on fire, they're going to roll the d20, and that is part of their number. And then they're also going to add their attribute dice, which for a score of 4 is a d10. And they roll the d10 and they add that to their total. But the even cooler thing about that is that in Open Legend, every die explodes. So if you ever roll the maximum number on any die, you get to re-roll that die and add the new number to the original total. Which means that if you have some lucky die rolls, you can have some massive results. And this kind of seems like overkill in some respects, but it just creates this amazing cinematic moments where you can not only succeed, but wow, you succeed. And also, I'm not going to get into combat in this video. I might do another one on that. But the way that you do damage is by exceeding someone's defense score that you are attacking with a particular action. And so if you go with this incredibly huge number, you have a certain amount of benefits to that. But one of the hugest ones is you're doing an incredible amount of damage. So if you have exploding dice that just keep on exploding, it's a lot of fun. And you can just cheer people on as they keep on adding 10s to their roll. Open Legend also has something called advantage and disadvantage. If anyone has played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you should be familiar with the terminology. It functions a little bit differently in this game, but it should be familiar to you. In fact, if someone has an attribute score of 0, and they have advantage or disadvantage, it basically functions the same way it does in that other game. You roll 2 d20s, and you use the higher number if you have advantage and the lower number if you have disadvantage. If you have an attribute score in that particular attribute of 1 or greater, you add that advantage or disadvantage to the number of attribute dice that you roll. So if you have an attribute score of 4, like my Pyromancer, you're going to roll a d10 as your attribute die. But if you have advantage 2 on that roll, you're now going to roll 3 dice, and you're going to knock out the lower 2 and just keep the higher. If you have disadvantage 2 on that, you're going to roll 3 dice, but you're going to knock out the 2 higher numbers and be forced to keep the lower. It's a unique take on the concept of advantage and disadvantage, and I like what they're trying to do with it because it gives you another incentive to have at least a score of 1 in as many attributes as possible in order to lessen the effects of having disadvantage and increase the effects of having advantage on a roll. Anytime you get to roll more dice, it's more fun. So, is Open Legend open source? And the answer is yes, but. So the core rulebook itself is not open source, and that's because there are things in it which they have retained copyright for. That includes all the artwork and the flavor text, which if you're paging through the book, it's anything that appears in a blue box. Officially on the website, what is open sourced is the system reference document for Open Legend. And that's what you can use for your games. However, at the moment, the SRD is not publicly available, and that is because it is currently being edited in order to come up to the current version of the game. And they hope to have that out relatively soon. However, talking with folks on Discord and also on their forums, one of the things that comes out about the SRD is if you're not using the artwork or any of the blue box text, basically all of the main body text of the core rulebook for Open Legend is essentially the SRD, and you're pretty clear in using that without worry. But I really would like to see that SRD get released to the public so they can solidly say, here's our source code, we are an open source game. Needs to be done, it will be done soon. Open Legend is published under an open source license of their own creation, the Open Legend Community License, and this has 3 basic requirements that you use in order to develop a game using the Open Legend SRD. The first of these is that you put the Open Legend Community License inside your game somewhere in the text. The second of these is that you include an Open Legend licensed product badge somewhere on your cover or on your box or on the front page of your materials that you put out. These are available for free on Open Legend's website. They actually look pretty cool. And the third is that your product cannot contain anything that is illegal, slanderous, defamatory, fraudulent, obscene, pornographic, or abusive. Now, the first of these things really is not that contentious, although the licensing badge is something that I've seen people push back for on other concepts. But that third one is. And the reason why is because folks don't want to put out a product that puts them at the whims of someone else's interpretation of what is fraudulent or obscene or divisive or illegal. And they just have a hard time trusting another organization to deal with that fairly. This came up recently because Wizards of the Coast, which owns the IP for Dungeons and Dragons, tried to redo their open gaming license. And they included a very similar clause in the new license about this. And people freaked out. Not the least of which is because Wizards of the Coast had shown that they'd violated that very clause in their own official products, and 2, nobody trusted them to not bring the hammer down on someone who was creating something that was competing with their product. And so there was a lot of mistrust that got sown between Wizards of the Coast and the wider community, not because people wanted to be able to put all sorts of awful things in their games, although there are terrible people out there who enjoy doing stuff like that. There are folks who want to be open and inclusive and really invite as many people around the table as they possibly can. And even they were not trusting a corporation to fairly arbitrate what these things actually meant. And so Wizards of the Coast actually backed off from that. This is something that I find interesting, and I wonder if Open Legend's going to have to shift. This is in part because Wizards of the Coast, as part of their retreat from the OGL debacle, they took the entire system reference document for the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons and put it out as Creative Commons. It is now arguably more open source than Open Legend because there are less restrictions on how you can use the material, at least the core Dungeons & Dragons. So I'm wondering if Open Legend is going to have to shift their licensing concept and maybe shift more towards Creative Commons just to be able to keep that open source byline. It is technically true, and yet people are going to be looking at games like 5th edition D&D now, and also Basic Fantasy, the entire thing is Creative Commons, and go, well, that might be the gold standard. What are you going to do about it? It should be interesting to watch, but I do want to point out that Open Legend is an open source game, and keeping things like their flavor text and their artwork under strict copyright, that is not a violation of open source at all. And this is part of the way that they're creating a product that they can sell to folks in order to keep the game running, and that's perfectly fine. It's just that some of the restrictions they put on might now seem to be a little bit too locked down, given the way the community is moving more towards the Creative Commons or the ORC license that Paizo is now putting out. It will be interesting to watch. The entire tabletop role-playing game community is currently in a grand stage of flux. It's going to be fascinating for folks like me to be part of. So what do I think of this game? I love it. Of all the games that I have read since I've been back in the tabletop role-playing hobby space, this is the one that has sparked my imagination like none other. It took me back to my childhood when I would be rummaging through basically a garbage can full of Legos, looking for that one piece that would allow me to take my imagination and make it something real. And that's what this game is. It's like a huge bin of Legos that you get to rummage through to make whatever concept your imagination can come up with and then unleash it into a world. And yet it also has guidelines for the way that your creation and other players' creations and the world the GM makes are going to interact with one another. So it is absolutely fascinating. And in fact, my dream of running an open legend game is to have it span multiple genres with the same characters. Maybe they just are walking through a dimension door and they end up in different realities left and right, and make the players reimagine the narrative description of how their abilities work, from fantasy to science fiction to post-apocalyptic, maybe to like Cold War spying. And it would be really fun to do. This is something that has me excited, and I've put off doing this review because I wanted to do the game justice. It's really, really cool. And you can get the game from their website, although as of this recording, the print book is currently out of stock. I have talked with the creator, and it should be back in stock, they hope, by sometime in February. When it comes back, it will be $40 for the print and PDF bundle. If you are in a hurry, you can just buy the PDF for $20. Let me give you one warning with that. I tried reading the PDF in iBooks on my Apple iPad and in preview on Mac OS, and it did not like loading on there. There's something in there that's a little bit wonky. I did open the PDF fine on my iPad in both Goodreader and PDF Expert. It worked fine in that. So you are not totally limited. And if you're on Windows and you're using Acrobat or something else, you should be fine. There is also a campaign book that is on sale currently on the website. This is kind of the official one that came out with Kickstarter, and that is going for a combination print and PDF bundle for $20 right now. That's 50% off the cover price. I might actually be picking this up, even though I might get yelled at because it's my birthday and I'm going to be getting presents, but still, 50% off is 50% off. Needless to say, I think this is a game that is so worth picking up. And the best thing about it is that you can go to their website, openlegend.com, and actually read the entirety of the core rules on their site right now for free. That's how I got introduced to the game, and it's a good way to kind of dive in to see if this is something that would interest you as well. And if it does, go out and get this book when it comes back in stock because it's really cool. So, what's coming up next for the channel? Well, my next game review is going to be on the first draft release of the 4th edition of Basic Fantasy RPG, which is dropped on their website. This is not the final product, but it is a draft product. This is the first Creative Commons version of the game, and I am so looking forward to see what that group came up with. But beyond that, I'm also going to be doing a couple of shorter reviews on some products that the good folks at 1985 Games sent me. And these are some cool items that have me rethinking whether or not I might be able to run a game with minis without knocking the entire world over. I'm looking forward to sharing them all with you. Until then, folks, happy playing, everyone.